Hi, everybody. Uh, Welcome to the June edition of Public Lab's Open Hour. We're pretty excited to have 3 community researchers and 3 environmental lawyers discussing concepts of proof. The community researchers have all gone out and captured environmental data that has been used in advocacy of various sorts, and the environmental lawyers have variously prosecuted civil and criminal cases using other sets of environmental data. So I'm going to pass it directly to the presenters to share a 5-minute deep dive, less about their overall project and more about what was the purpose of collecting the data they did and what were the twists and turns that their campaigns or cases have taken by seeking to use that data. So thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. Audience members, we have a chat room going. Find it at publiclab.org/openhour. After everyone presents, we'll be reading your questions in that you have placed there in the chat room. Thanks. Okay, Noelle, take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Noelle. I'm the Executive Director of Seek NYC. And the data that we collect is temperature data. So each winter there are over 230,000 heat complaints that come in, and this is from tenants who live in rental buildings whose landlords are not providing them with adequate heat in their apartments. It's a huge problem. It's really hard to prove. Up until we started our work, tenants would actually handwrite a temperature log. They would write the time of day, the time of year, the indoor temperature, the outdoor temperature, because those are all the things that HPD, which is the city agency that enforces the housing code, those are all the things that HPD would want to see in order to determine if the building is below New York City's standard for temperature in rental buildings in the wintertime. So we saw that people were really struggling to prove when sort of either negligent landlords or even sometimes malicious landlords were not providing adequate heat in the winter. And so what we did is we built a very simple temperature sensor. It's essentially a thermometer that's connected to the internet. And what it does is it takes a temperature reading once an hour and sends that temperature data to our internal servers, and then tenants can sign up for an account and they can actually log in and view their temperature data, and they can use that data in negotiations with their landlord or in a housing court setting in order to compel their landlord to turn the heat back on. So I can show really quickly what our temperature log looks like so that you guys can see. This is a sample heat log. Yep. Sweet. So it's a sample heat log. It shows the indoor temperature, the outdoor temperature, the time of day. We know that heat season is from October 1st to May 31st. You can see that sort of up in the upper left-hand corner. And we see that there are different rules around what the temperature has to be inside depending on the time of day. So it's from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. It's got to be above 68 in your apartment if it's less than 55 outside. And from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., it's got to be above 55 in your apartment if it's less than 40 degrees outside. So we basically collate all of this temperature data and timestamp data and provide tenants with this heat log that they can download and take with them to housing court. I'm going to stop sharing real quick to make sure. And so as we started to do this work, what we saw was that, we sort of had this very Law and Order SVU vision of how people would use this data in court. They would take it to housing court, they'd have a lawyer, their lawyer would take it to trial, they would all argue, and then our data would be the thing that would come in and say, we have irrefutable proof, been logged as evidence that you don't have heat in the apartment. And what we found is that New York City Housing Court, at least, is a whole other beast. It's most everything takes place during negotiations, sort of in a side room. Almost nothing goes to trial. But what we also found is that didn't really impact the utility of our data at all. We were still able to use our data, and the tenants that we work with, their lawyers were able to use our data to get better settlements in housing court. So things like the landlord says in a stipulation that they will turn the heat on. And then if they don't, we can use our data to bring them back on contempt because they said in writing, in a legally binding document, that they would turn the heat on. And now we have data that shows that they haven't been doing that. Or we can get things like, if we have data that shows that from February to March, the landlord wasn't providing heat, we can actually get tenants a rent abatement where they're getting money off of the rent that they have to pay because they weren't getting the services that were baked into their rent to begin with. So things like that are real wins for us in a housing court situation. Yeah, and really quickly I'll just talk about sort of how we designed and implement sort of the deployment strategy for the sensors. So we designed the sensors to be as accurate as the handheld thermometer that HPD inspectors use when they actually come out in person to a building to do a temperature inspection. So they are accurate to ±1 degree. And then we actually got a hold of the HPD inspector manual that says, go into the building, go into the apartment that's called, find the coldest room in the apartment that's not a kitchen or a bathroom, that's not in a room with a window AC unit or an obvious draft, and take a temperature reading that's about 3 feet off the ground. So when we go in and install our sensors, we follow all of those guidelines and we stick them on the wall about 3 feet off the ground. We've used tamper-proof tape to make sure that the tenants don't move them. So we really thought about kind of how we can make our data as credible as possible so that tenants are able to use it to score real wins in housing court. So with that, I will pass it on to whoever's next.
Hey, I think that's me. This is Scott. Oh. Hey. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Hey, this is Scott Eustace in New Orleans. I work for a group, Gulf Restoration Network, and I do investigations of polluting industries. We have a lot of industry in Louisiana, a lot of which lets loose during storms, but this particular case was a coal terminal that exports a lot of coal and petroleum coke to Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, etc. for fuel over there. And it had just been polluting for forever. This is one of these like open secrets. And as far as proof, anyone nowadays can go on Google Earth, and if you Google Davant, Louisiana, D-A-V-A-N-T, Louisiana, you'll see these big black piles. And if you look on the east bank of the river, at the downstream pile, you'll see right now, there's a big black plume coming off of this facility. And that's against the Clean Water Act. It's pretty clear. The Federal Clean Water Act of the United States has provisions for what are called narrative water quality standards. So these are kind of the intuitive things. If you see a bunch of junk floating in a river, it's a violation. And so even this company had been making violations visible from space. No one had taken action to clean it up. The big piles were a nuisance down in Plaquemines for people that lived there. There are big uncovered piles of coal and pet coke, and a lot of people have asthma, barrel chest, and lung cancer problems. It's kind of the disease progression, and so a lot of the community struggles that have been suing these terminals over the air impacts, and we started noticing it just because we were taking pictures of leaks in the Gulf of Mexico and then the old oil infrastructure in Breton Sound in Louisiana. And it was like running a red light in front of a cop. We started taking pictures from the airplane and sending them to the Department of Environmental Quality, but we wouldn't get much, right? From them. So we started to, since we weren't getting anything from the executive branch of government, our pictures weren't proof, Google Earth is not proof, we started preparing to go to court. And with the public lab kite, we were able to get a picture. I'll show it in a minute. That was so bad. It was another instance of proof. It was another data point in this, ongoing struggle with the community to have these companies clean up. But it was bad enough of a picture, and it illuminated a new aspect of the problem that it did motivate the government to do something. There's like kind of an inescapable wrong. Let's see if I can do this. Under the Clean Water Act, citizens of the United States, the citizens of the United States can bring what's called a citizen suit if there's so-called ongoing pollution. I think hopefully you'll be able to see that pop up.
Yep, that looks great, Scott.
Screen.
Yep, that looks great, Scott.
Okay, I've got some arrow annotations, and you can see. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the top left corner is white, which shows you. The kite photo is a little off kilter, but it captures something that pictures from airplane could not, and that is a whole pile of coal and pet coke in the Mississippi River. This is on the right is a concrete armored. You can see a little green grass. That's the river levee. It protects the river from flooding the whole terminal, and so the water in most of the picture, in the water that barge on the left-hand side is floating in, is the Mississippi River, and this terminal was offloading through that orange conveyor belt, and it was spilling so much right under the conveyor belt that it was making a pile. So the pile, think of the pile signified that it wasn't just a one-time thing. We weren't just lucky in capturing, Google Earth wasn't lucky in capturing events. The pile has to accumulate over time, like sands in an hourglass. So it definitely was a great photo because it was a great representation of this legal concept of ongoing pollution. So finally, the government guys saw this and started to take action. Of course, they were taking action on this one day, just using one day. We had to go to court that when you file a citizen suit, you have to file a 60-day notice, which allows the government to try to take remedial action to do their job to clean it up. They took some actions, but the judge allowed us to present, all of our other evidence to get this company fined. And I'm happy to say, beyond the fines, that the company looks a lot better. at least when we look at it now. It still looks pretty bad on Google Earth if you go look at it, but they've started to they retooled this conveyor belt and they covered the barges. But I do think that this photo was pretty evocative at the time, and finally constituted proof, even though people had been complaining about this for years, and we had even been sending some nasty pictures. So that's what I have, and I think I'm going to hand it over to Jackie. Jackie, are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready. My name is Jackie James, and I am with a community group called Citizen Science Community Resources in Tonawanda, New York. And I have a slide presentation that I'm going to bring up. Can everyone see that?
It looks great, Jackie.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about how we used citizen-based science and how that aided in the prosecution of a local corporation called Tonawanda Coke Corporation. And in those pictures you see us on the left-hand side, and that's me second to the right with the Bucket Brigade. That's a homemade air sampler that we took to take an air sample in Tonawanda. And on the right, you see Tonawanda Coke Corporation, and Tonawanda Coke Corporation makes something called foundry coke, and foundry coke is used for an energy source in making steel. So you see that it can be a very nasty, dirty process from that picture. And I'll tell you a little bit about Tonawanda. Is that it has 78,000 residents, and it also has an industrial corridor where we have 53 air-regulated facilities. So it's a very industrial community right next to many residents. So in 2004, we questioned, could it be something in our air that is making us sick? This issue it affected me personally. I have something called fibromyalgia. It's a chronic illness. It's a neuromuscular disorder, and there's no blood test to determine that I have it. It's a diagnosis by elimination. And I started speaking out to my neighbors, and obviously there were many more people that were sick, and we wondered if it was something in our air that was making us sick. So what we decided to do, we did a little background research, and we found, we heard about Denny Larson and Global Community Monitor and the Bucket. And Denny came out in Tonawanda in about 2003 time frame, and he showed us how to make this air sampler, which you see on the left. That's me and another founder of our community group. We called ourselves the Clean Air Coalition at the time. And we took an air sample outside Tonawanda Coke in 2004, but we didn't realize that Tonawanda Coke was the culprit. Again, it was a very complicated situation because we have so many industrial facilities. We just knew that our air stunk and there were a lot of people that were sick, what was causing it. So when we got the results back from that bucket sample, there were many chemicals in it, but the one that was most concerning was benzene. So from there, we narrowed our search down from 53 facilities. We narrowed it down to about 5 facilities of where possibly this benzene could be coming from. So at that point, we took our data and we took it to the New York State DEC and the EPA and a local university. And we had somebody within inside one of the agencies sort of pushing us towards this company called Tonawanda Coke Corporation. They had the owner of the company had a history of not being a very good industrial neighbor. So we suspected that it was this company without having the smoking gun proof at this point. So what they did is the DEC applied for an EPA grant, and there was a large research project funded. From 2007 to 2008, there were air monitors, high-tech air monitors placed in our community, 4 of them, and they collected data for 1 year. And at the end of that 1 year, actually it was in the June of 2009, they presented the results of this 1-year study, and this picture is a little blurry, but inside that circle is Tonawanda Coke. What they did is they obviously used air modeling, and those are pollution roses to determine where the benzene was coming from. So this research study was our smoking gun, and this is the information then that Aaron Mango and the Department of Justice used some of the scientific information to prosecute the company. So I just wanted to make it clear that our citizen data was not used directly in the prosecution of this company. However, our data was instrumental in getting this larger study, which then was used in the lawsuit. So again, that was a really important study. In 2009, we thought, my background is science. I'm a science person. I thought, oh my gosh, we got this study. That's it. That's the end of the campaign. You know, I'm not a community organizer. I'd learned how to do that. But I thought everything was over and done with at that point. Well, I was wrong because people were sitting on it. And so we realized that we needed more help with organizing the community. At that point, we had enough funds to hire someone, and we held a protest outside the gates of Tonawanda Coke. We had tried to meet with the owner of the company. We sent him letters 3 times, and 3 times we were rejected as a community. So we said, well, if he's not gonna come to us and meet with us, we're going to come to him. And we protested outside the gates of Tonawanda Coke. And there was a lot of media. This was, again, a pivoting point. And that October 2009, Aaron Mango, which is going to speak next, he took notice of our cause. And the next few years, which again Aaron is going to go into, there was a big win that successfully, Aaron and the Department of Justice, they indicted, prosecuted, and successfully convicted Tonawanda Coke, and Mark Kamholtz is the environmental manager. So these last 2 slides, I know I'm supposed to only be 5 minutes, but again, this is what the formula we used, once again, for the benzene, the air situation. We went back and used the same formula for the soil. We thought that Tonawanda Coke, there was also black particulate matter coming off the facility, and we thought it was migrating off-site and into the soil and contaminating the soil in our neighborhoods. So again, we asked the question, is this contamination in our soil and posing a threat to us? We collected several samples, about 30 of them. We found contaminants called PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and we used that information. We put that together in a proposal, and when the judge in the case he requested community projects before the sentencing of the company, and we submitted our project. It's a $750,000 comprehensive soil study, and at the sentencing, the judge funded our study. So he also funded an $11 million health study, and as you see, those are the results. We had big results. Most importantly, we are breathing cleaner air in Tonawanda. There's been a 92% reduction in benzene, and they were also forced to install air pollution control equipment. The black particulate matter is drastically reduced. And the environmental manager was sent to jail. So a big win for our community. And that's it. Thank you. I think Aaron's up next.
Okay. My name is Aaron. I'm a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Buffalo, New York, and I've been with the Department of Justice just about 9 years. And so, interestingly, you heard from Jackie, but my case, as Jackie noted, did not involve at all the use of her samples that she had taken, but it was really her samples were the impetus for further study and pressure on the regulatory agencies, particularly the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and then the Environmental Protection Agency, which got into the game, if you will, and started to conduct a larger, more scientifically rigorous air study, which ended up generating a tremendous amount of public interest. And as in one of Jackie's slides, you saw a news article that she was pictured in the news article, and I was standing next to it. Well, that was the actual news article that in effect started our criminal case here in Buffalo. I was at my parents' house and reading the Buffalo News, and it came out, it was Sunday, October 11th, and I just happened to pick up the paper that day at my parents' house, read it, and figured, you know what, this doesn't seem right, the amount of benzene in the air, so we should take a look at that. Now, the next day was Columbus Day, so federal holiday here for us government folks, and the next day was Tuesday, and I sent an email off to the Environmental Protection Agency special agents I work with, and we were then off and running and taking a look into the criminal case, and ended up building, I think, a pretty successful criminal case that involved the taking of scientific samples. And that's why I know we're all here today, is to discuss the sort of the concepts of proof and how evidence in a scientific introduced into a court of law. So in terms of community-generated science and results, I didn't use any of those. So I've got to admit that straight up. But what we did use was a lot of samples that had been taken from the Environmental Protection Agency during search warrants that we executed at the property. And that was done, and I guess most importantly is, as long as from a prosecutor's point of view, if the samples are taken in a scientifically sound manner, which for environmental criminal prosecutions would essentially mean taken in a manner consistent with an EPA test method and an EPA sampling method. And then sent, if the samples are at that point then sent to an accredited lab, a nationally accredited lab that is accredited to conduct the test that is going to reveal whatever pollutant we're looking for, then I'm happy, and then I can use those results. If not, then the scientists who are on the stand, the sampling tech team, really the whole criminal case then falls under attack if we're not using an accredited lab, if we're not using scientifically sound sampling techniques and or analysis, because in the criminal cases we have an extremely high burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which means it's like 98%. There's really no definition to beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's something that obviously you wouldn't doubt doing in your reasonable life as a human being. You pretty much are certain that something is what it is. So in our case, in fact, we had our case involved really it was a big component of it was the hazardous air pollutants that were going into the community and poisoning the town of Tonawanda and the community, Grand Island, everybody around there that really had been poisoned by this excessive benzene for 25, 30 years. And that was kind of the draw of our case. But we also had other components of our case, which included a hazardous waste component that samples were taken in a scientifically rigorous manner and tested appropriately. And then we had one other final component of our case, which involved an unknown substance that was found inside of a railroad tanker car on the southern portion of the Tonawanda Coke property. And we had learned during the criminal investigation that the company had taken this unknown liquid, which smelled almost like brake fluid and or some other volatile organic compound, and sprayed it on the coke prior to burning onto the coal prior to burning the coal in the coke ovens. And that would be illegal if that material was a hazardous waste. So we ended up searching, entering the property, and taking samples from these railroad cars. And the middle railroad car had enough to be sampled, and we sent it off for analysis, and it was sent to an EPA lab. Well, it turned out that the way that analysis was done was not consistent with the analysis that's recommended under EPA test method. I think it's 13, I have it open in a different screen, method 1311, which is the toxic characteristic leaching procedure test method. A step was essentially skipped. And at that point then, myself and the co-prosecutor who was prosecuting this case with me had a decision to make. Either we proceeded, now the analysis had shown that the contents of this railroad tanker car were in fact hazardous, contained an excessive amounts of benzene, and were contained some other chemicals that would potentially make it hazardous as well. But knowing that now we would expose our lab personnel, who would have to justify why they skipped a step, to probably pretty brutal cross-examination in an already very technical case, myself and my co-prosecutor decided it was best to, in fact, dismiss that count. And that's what we did. So count 19 of our original indictment got dismissed, and it got dismissed because we were really not happy with how the lab, the EPA lab nonetheless, which was accredited, handled this particular EPA test method 1311. Now we got other convictions, and the company and the environmental manager were convicted on RCRA charges and hazardous waste charges. But it's just kind of an example, I guess, for this forum to let you know in terms of not only taking the sample in an appropriate procedure, using the right equipment, either cleaning it or disposing of the equipment after each sample you take, but also then getting it tested by people who are going to do it the right way. So that's kind of my story here, without going too much into the a war story or kind of more facts about our case. I would say, and I'm sure the other two environmental attorneys who are on are aware of the case, the key Supreme Court case that came out, Daubert v. Merrill Dow Pharmaceutical. It was decided in 1993, and that is the lead Supreme Court case that it's easy, you just look it up. It's available in a variety of different spots where you could read the whole decision. And it talks about the admissibility of scientific evidence in federal courts and pretty much in all courts around the country, because most state courts have adopted a Daubert-type standard, which essentially holds that as long as your scientific evidence is there's sort of a multi-factor test that you look at to see if the scientific evidence is reliable. That's the key. Is it valid and reliable? And the way you look at that is it subject to peer review? Is there a known error rate associated with it? Is it subjected to replication and such? And there's certain factors that you can look at, but that is the key case. That's what controls. If you really want to get into it, you would also read Federal Rule of Evidence 702, which is the Federal Rule of Evidence which governs scientific or expert testimony. That's pretty much all I had, so I'll pass the microphone at this point.
Hey, Chris, I'm not sure we can hear you yet.
All right. You got me?
Yeah,
Okay. All right. And you can see me as well?
yeah.
All right, great. So I'm also an environmental lawyer, and I think that was a good place to leave off and where I'll pick up. I'm a lawyer. Typically, I represent individuals who have been injured by exposures to coke plants, to benzene, to sewage sludge, to all kinds of things in the environment. And I also have done some work with nonprofits with respect to Clean Water Act issues and other environmental type cleanup claims. And I do have some slides, so I'm going to switch over to my slides and spare you looking at me further. I think if I can get this to work. Please work. I'm clicking the button. Come on, we tested this. I'm failing.
The green button.
The green button is not working. Huh. Well, I'm going to go without. Well, that's not really helpful. Do we want to?
I have your slides. Would you like me to show them?
Yeah, can you? Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, I'm clicking the screen share button. I'm not getting what I used to get.
Well, who knew the method wasn't proven?
Well,
Uh-oh.
we did. Well, I can.
Actually, Chris, I don't have your slides yet. I had Adon's.
Okay.
My apologies.
I wonder. I hesitate to reload the window or do anything, but it would really help. Do we want to?
Go ahead, hit reload. We're fine. And you know what? We're going to go to Adon first.
Okay.
And just yeah, we'll be back with you.
Okay, that's too bad, but okay, let's do that.
Hey, Adon. Nice treadmill, by the way.
I'm stopping it now. No background noise. How are we doing?
Very good. We see you, we hear you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So Chris might cut me off and jump back in. What I wanted to make clear right up front is to anybody who's watching this later in the public labs community, many of you have a tendency, which is wonderful, to be very tech savvy and look for very interesting and novel applications of the techniques that you're familiar with, whether they are remote sensing and analysis of remotely sensed data, or air filters, or chemical sampling. I mean, some of you even have access to mass spectrometers. So, you know, you guys have a lot of tech skills. What I want to emphasize to you is that in the law, oftentimes it's easier and best to not overthink it and to focus first on the easiest form of data you can gather. And most of the time, that's visual data. So the first big point is that if you're helping with, or you want to help with, investigations and litigation, the first thing you really need to know is what legal question are the lawyers that you're working with or that you want to work with trying to answer. So for example, the easiest Clean Water Act cases, and Scott talked about it a little bit, and I do a lot of these, are discharge without a permit cases. And I'm going to try to screen share, and I'll show you a discharge without a permit. 1 second here. I am screen sharing. Does everybody see this lovely truck?
Yes.
Great. So you are watching 2 employees in Brooklyn of a fuel trucking company power washing their fuel truck. And they're doing it in a public street. And this picture was very lo-fi. It was taken by a community group member who's part of a canoeing group that works on Newtown Creek and actually works for public labs sometimes. I know it sounds nuts that there are people who canoe on Newtown Creek, but there you have it. There are people who want to reclaim it as a usable water body. And on their way to the boats, they saw this guy doing this. And they very thoughtfully used a cell phone to snap this picture and then to show us that the truck is parked on the side of the street and that the water runs down the street and that the water runs down the street all the way to the Gowanus Canal, which you can see over there, and that indeed it trickles over the edge and into the water body. Now that is a very simple, unpermitted discharge into the Gowanus Canal, which is a water of the United States. And that's a one-time discharge. But what was great about this photo is it gave us leverage to go back to the company in question which would be these guys right here, Enterprise Transportation. Very helpful in the photo. Another great thing about a visual is it gave me a name to work with. And call them and say, essentially, what the heck are you doing? And long story short, this got cleaned up. For other reasons, it also, other activities there has led to a criminal investigation in which some of Aaron's colleagues at the Department of Justice got involved in the EDNY, not in the Northern District of New York, but that's sort of a side story here. So in these cases, when someone's discharging without a permit, the most basic question is whether somebody is discharging pollutants into a water body. And in that kind of case, it's a great one for citizen scientists because, you know, pollutants is a very broad term under the Clean Water Act, so exactly what's being discharged doesn't really matter. What matters is that there's water running off this truck. It's a truck that delivers fuel oil. These guys didn't take any samples, even, of what's in this water. It could be pure H2O. I mean, you know, common sense tells you that if you're washing a truck that delivers gasoline all day and heavy fuel oil, and if you've seen pictures of these trucks in other periods of time, you know that it ain't just pure water coming off that truck. And that foam gives you an indication that there's something, some sort of suspended solid in there. So anyway, what's being discharged wasn't the most important question here. Just, is there a discharge? And time again, I see cases in which the least sophisticated data is often the most useful. Because, as Aaron was pointing out, the more elaborate data requires more elaborate framing and a much more careful methodology if it's going to be applied. Is this evidence? Who's the expert? Is there a chain of custody? If you're taking a sample, then you need to show where that sample's been and that it was properly preserved, that it's been kept in custody all the time. Pictures don't have that problem. Pictures are different than almost all other types of evidence, especially naked eye pictures. For those of you who are interested later this year, I'm happy to get into discussions about satellite observations, thermal IR, multispectral cameras, and what you can do with that kind of stuff. But naked pictures that are basically the equivalent of what some guy saw are evidence of what that guy saw. And if that person is willing to write an affidavit and eventually come into court and say, this picture fairly and accurately represents what I saw that day, that's all the evidence you need. There is no Daubert test. And so it's really lo-fi and incredibly effective. And what's wonderful about photos, particularly over, there are other simple data, you know, in-field water quality measures like temperature and pH and conductivity that you can take with a well-established machine. Those are great too. Like, photos are just so easy and they're so powerful. Here's another one that somebody took. This one, believe it or not, was taken by a guy who operates a crane, who was overlooking a cement plant and said, my God, what the hell are these people doing? And what's great about it is that we got time series. This is day one, and then a couple days later, the same thing was happening. And then a couple days later, you can see the cars parked have changed, and it's still happening again. Oh, that's a different case. Let me back it up. That kind of time series, this is just some guy with a cell phone, but we've got time series visual evidence that we can back up really easily. And we have in the past considered essentially putting out sort of almost drone bounties, like prizes for people who have drones, to go out and get this kind of data and see if we can get time series of things that look extremely suspicious. We've used public labs overhead data from kites in a very similar way. And then if you want to get a little bit fancier, but still very, very simple, there's public access satellite data. So here, for example, is a picture from a much more sophisticated citizens group. And I have to tell you, what you're looking at is a 1995 picture of a lakeside where up on the hill, and you just have to take my word for it. Can you guys see my cursor when I move my cursor?
Yes.
Great. So this lake over here has about a 200 or 300 foot drop between the road and lake down here and the railway line that's running over here and this hilltop over here. What's interesting about this site is that that gradient creates a big water pollution runoff problem. And this is a group, I want to emphasize, they did a lot of careful sampling, and they took water quality samples here and all over the place. But here's what really convinced me, and this is a case that's still under active investigation, and we're not ready to move too far. So I'm showing you these photos, but I'm not giving too many details. This is a 1995 photo, and pay attention to this area over here that I'm circling with my cursor. You can see that there's some sort of quarrying, mining operation going on up here. By 2006, there are two well-established piles here. These are actually salt piles. They're piles of salt being stored, which are eventually shipped off to companies that then do road salt work. And here's that area again, circled. And you can see the vegetation's burnt out there. Here's a 2007 picture, compiled by the same group, showing that there's a drainage system in place right below that burnt out area. And you can notice that there's green below it, there's green above it, and then here's the area where discharge seems to come off. There's actually essentially a channel or a tunnel cut here into the hillside, and it wraps into some culverts over here, and then runs into this little river, this little creek, which then runs into the bigger lake. And what this group did was simple time series data from publicly available satellite imagery. Most of this is from Google Earth. I think one or two early satellite photos they took from an archive at the local university, but it took them all of 20 minutes to get those two. And here you see the same vegetation two years later, burnt out, everything around it is green. The next year, same story. The area seems to be growing a little bit. Here's 6 years after that, so now this is 10 years on, and you can see very clearly everything below, there's a burnt out area of permanently dead vegetation. It has been for 10 years. Strong evidence that there's something running off here. You have this area where the channel is cut, and it seems to be picking up whatever's running down the hill, and then below it is green again. Now that is really simple, but it's really compelling, and it's really easy to explain. Let me get out of the screen share. I don't know how to stop the screen share. Any suggestions on how one stops the screen share? You are screen sharing, and anyway, I'll figure out how to stop screen sharing in a second. For now, you can all look at Scott. That is remarkably simple evidence that you can use, and you can go a long way with it. In cases where the person in question doesn't have a permit, that's about all the evidence you need. It's going to get you to an interesting negotiating point. So let me see if I can figure out. I can't figure this out for the life of me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to assume Chris is back, and want to leave you with that idea that you should first and foremost explore the lowest tech solution that you can, and see if you can get time series information. See if you can get lots of repetitions, high resolution pictures, and then if you want to get fancy, thermal, really interesting multispectral analysis of particularly of water pollution happening in rivers. But the low tech stuff goes a really, really long way, particularly in civil cases. And if it doesn't get you all the way to a civil conviction, it definitely helps you build your advocacy position and possibly negotiate a settlement with somebody who really doesn't want to try to explain to a federal judge why it is that, you know, their employees were washing a truck out in the street and clearly letting it run into the river, or how it is that, you know, a swath of vegetation large enough to be a ski hill has been burnt out for 15 years on the edge of their property. I'm going to mute out. I'm going to let Scott take over.
Okay, so this is Chris. Now, can you guys see my screen here now, finally? Yep. All right, so I want to pick up where Aaron and Adon left off, and I think the photographs, you know, the photographic evidence that Adon just talked about, you know, I could give you 10 or 15 examples of where I've used Google Earth and historic photographs and satellite photographs that are all generally publicly accessible. So I want to reinforce that point. It's a very good place to start when you're looking at environmental cases, particularly. But what I want to take that a little bit further, and so I want to talk a little bit about the background that Aaron left off with. As far as getting evidence admitted into court, I get a bunch of questions all the time. You know, how can we get evidence that's, you know, court admissible, right? That'll be admissible in court, as if this is a gold standard. And really, there's no. It's a very flexible standard made up of different factors, as Aaron referenced, and there's really no guarantee one way or the other as to what evidence would be admissible in court. And so I want to talk a little bit about how to approach that. The prongs that Aaron touched on, I think the most important of which are repeatability and reliability. So is the data reliable? So questions, if you're looking for bacteria, are you wearing gloves? Do you have sterile procedures in place? And then ultimately, for anything that's sent to a lab, what methods the lab used are all going to be important things. The big question, I think one of the biggest questions, is whether it's fit for its intended purpose. And so this raises questions about what is it that you're trying to prove? Are you trying to prove the presence of pollutants? Are you trying to prove what the source of the pollutants are? Or are you trying to do something that's very technical, such as proving that someone got cancer from a certain exposure? And then the final question is going to be whether it will assist the jury. And so let's go to a couple examples. This is a case that I worked on. It was a Clean Water Act case where I represented the Waterkeeper Alliance. And I've highlighted, hopefully you can see them where my cursor is. There was a source of pollutants here. There was also a source of pollutants from these chicken houses. And this is a drainage ditch that runs along this line with my cursor. And the property line was down here, and this was a point, the closest point where we could take samples. And so we had someone from the Waterkeeper Alliance take samples down at this property boundary, and we were looking for discharges from this farm into this ditch. And so if we talk about these prongs of reliability, the question, since we were looking for bacteria, the question about gloves and sterility became a real issue. And then the question of what was the intended purpose, and our purpose was to show that there were bacterial discharges and nitrate and phosphorus discharges coming from that agricultural operation. And so if we look in a little bit of detail, getting back to the photographic evidence, this is from that top circle, and this is a pile, it turned out to be sewage sludge, but this is a pile of human waste, where you can see two areas that the farmer had actually trenched drainage to go to the ditch. And so this is human waste that's draining off into the ditch, treated human waste, but I put treated in quotes, minimally treated human waste going off into the ditch. And so again, to get this photograph in, and we talked a lot about photographs, so I don't want to focus on that, but basically the intended purpose is just to show that he trenched drainage into this farm runoff ditch, and clearly that this picture is relevant to that inquiry and would assist the jury in making that determination. This is from the second point that I highlighted on that photograph, and this is at the property boundary where the drainage ditch runs off. And the question here for purposes of Clean Water Act liability is whether the drainage ditch flows to waters of the U.S. and there's got to be some, relatively constant drainage there. And so again, a very simple picture that was just taken here, but it shows that, indeed that there's a flow from that farm ditch down across the road, and then ultimately we mapped out and followed that it went to waters of the United States. So that proved our, our connection to federal waters for jurisdictional purposes. Let's talk a little bit about something that's maybe a little bit more thought of as citizen science or scientific, and this maybe relates to the questions that were of issue in Jackie's case with the Coke plant. So here I put better is not always more. So if you think at two extremes, and I'm going to give an example, but you could hire someone with a PhD to go and do a lot of sampling, and they could send it off to the best quality lab, and they could take certain number of samples, but that comes with a price, and so you have to pay the person's time, you have to pay the lab to analyze the samples. And so what I'm saying here is better is not always more, in the sense that you really have to think about what you want to prove and what your constraints are. So if you have a budget, you might realize that more data may be actually better than better quality data. And I know you'd never want to tell that to a judge, that one data is of lesser quality than the other, but I think just the example of someone with a PhD to take the samples kind of gives you an idea. There may be overkill on the quality, so as long as you're maintaining that balance between quality and quantity of data, I think that's the important thing. And I want to kind of give you an example in this context, and this is another Coke plant. This is a plant that I'm looking at currently, and you can probably figure out where it is based on the streets that are marked here. But there's a big Coke plant, and then you can see there's a bunch of coal or pet Coke or whatever this is that sits in the middle of these two neighborhoods. And so what I tried to show with the dollar signs is, let's assume that the big dollar signs represent hire the PhD and use the best quality lab and send off your samples. And assuming that we're constrained by a budget, we could make it $5,000, $10,000, $20,000. But the obvious point is that if we're going with the high dollar approach, you're going to be able to take fewer samples, right? So if your question is, where is the pollution in this neighborhood coming from, and you can only take, for example, 3 samples because you went top dollar and you hired the guy with 3 degrees to do the sampling, compare that to the low-cost example. And so let's say you still use a good quality lab, but you hire or you use local activists that maybe read about the sampling. They get information from the lab that tells them how to properly take a sample. They wear gloves. They take the necessary precautions, but they don't have certifications and degrees to go along with it. And you maybe have some money left over to where you can take much more samples. And so, at the extreme, you see that we can take samples close to the sources, and then we can take samples going out into the neighborhood. And the benefit of that is that if you're trying to show that the source is this Coke plant up here, or these piles of black waste right here, which maybe is pet coke or coal, then the locations of these samples are going to help you map out, based on the concentrations and where the presence of those pollutants are, what the likely source is. So again, if you're hiring somebody to ultimately testify in court that these piles of waste are the source of pollutants and maybe are causing illness and injury in the community or property damage in the community, then there's certainly a balance between taking a few samples at super high quality maybe and taking a lot more samples, getting a lot more information at what I would say is possibly or arguably a slightly lower quality, but still sufficient to balance that out and prove your point. And so here again, I guess this is the summary of what I just went through. You can spend a lot of money on highly degreed consultants and fancy labs, but you may not get the full picture. And so just like a court or a defendant may tell you you can't draw a conclusion because you used citizen science, they could also tell you can't draw a conclusion because you only have 3 samples, and those samples don't tell you enough information. So it's really somewhat of a moving target, and you need to use judgment. But there's no fixed answer that says you need to hire someone with a PhD and they need to go to this lab or that lab. One of the points that I always like to make is that most academics who do research and publish on these things in journals, they don't use EPA labs. They use their own labs. And so as long as they're using reliable methods and as long as their labs have good protocols, it's really a question about the details of what their lab did and how reliable their data is versus paying a certain someone who's got a certification to do something. So again, reliability, more money, maybe arguably more precise and more reliable, but to get a better picture of what's going on, more data points may be the better answer for you. And so, you've got to really ultimately address what the purpose is. And, if the purpose is to identify the source of pollutants, I would argue that 3 samples is probably not your best bet. You probably want something that gives you a better picture of where those pollutants are going and what the concentration is relative to what you believe to be the source. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, everyone. So to briefly recap, we've just heard from 3 community researchers. Noel with an Internet of Things approach to collecting temperature data on indoor environments. Scott with kite aerial photography method, capturing oblique photos of hourglass sand-like coal pollution that meet the definition of ongoing pollution under the Clean Water Act. And we've heard from Jackie, who collected physical air samples with a bucket from Home Depot and had that tested at a lab, which kicked off a very long media campaign and prosecution process. We also heard from 3 lawyers who have prosecuted both criminal and civil cases, discussing various types of evidence that they've used to make their arguments. And so I would like to open up now to Q&A. There are 3 questions in the queue so far. First up is Scott, who asked a question right here in chat. Next up is Jeff with his question that he put in chat. And then I will read out Stevie's question since she hasn't joined the call. All right. Scott, go ahead.
Well, I had a question about using what's presented in Google Earth. Just first of all, I think a lot of what's on Google Earth is actually USGS, and our lawyers were very diligent. They only wanted me to use the photos from Google Earth if we could find the source. And USGS is I think more than half of what's on Google Earth, but then we had a bunch that were just being sourced from private companies, and I failed to find that private aerial company. I couldn't ask them to verify it was true, so we ended up not admitting those. I wanted to hear from the lawyers what their opinion on that kind of thing. Were we being really cautious, or would you use something, it's presented by Google Earth, a private corporation, but you don't know the airplane? Because certainly the opposition lawyers, when they did discovery on us, they had us list, the pilots in the airplanes that we were using to fly over the facility and crazy stuff like that.
I've got some thoughts on that. If
yeah, I'll jump in if you guys don't.
Okay, great. Chris, then Aaron. Thank you.
Go ahead. I'll jump in after you.
Okay. Yeah. So it's interesting. We used in the environmental case that I just showed. We used both private flyover planes for real time for current photos, and then we also used Google Earth. And like you said, I mean, they wanted to talk about who flew the flight and how we got up there and all that other things. But with respect to Google Earth, we used them without challenge from the defendants. They when you get into litigation, you can fight about a lot of things, but when it gets time for trial and you're trying to get exhibits in front of the court, a lot of defendants will back off on what they're going to challenge because common sense would tell you, typically on Google Earth there's a little capture date at the bottom, and I think we've gotten to a point that most lawyers would agree that unless there's some discrepancy with the photo or some reason for concern, at least in my experience, which has been a couple of times using those photos, generally they get admitted, or in the other side, tends to back away from any challenge with respect to them.
Great, thanks. Aaron.
Oh, sure. We actually did have a aerial photograph issue in the Tonawanda Cove case, but we used our photographs from Pictometry International, which is actually a company located in Rochester, New York. And it turns out that's the company, at least back when our case was running, that Bing uses to contract for their aerial photography. And in response to your question, Scott, I would say that in a criminal case, absolutely, I've got to be able to put somebody on the stand to talk about how those photographs were taken, or I'm never going to get those photographs in unless I have an actual, if we charter a plane and have a photographer up in the air and actually take them, I need somebody to say, I think it was either Chris or Adon who said it, that the photograph, which is a very powerful, is at its heart very easy to get into evidence. But what you need somebody to say that is fair and accurately, or that is fairly and accurately representing what it's supposed to depict, which is an aerial flyover of the Tonawanda Coke Corporation. So basically, without that, I can't get it into evidence. Now, in the Tonawanda Coke case, we had gone to the step of actually having ready to go people from Pictometry International to come in and testify, and then the part we stipulated to the evidence. So Chris is right. When push comes to shove and you're really ready to get there, defendants will, because you also do not want to make the judge have to decide issues or put before the jury contested issues that really have no import. So we got stipulations. We were going to use a set of like 5 aerial photographs. We had just a a typed up document that said these are the exhibits we are going to use. A representative from Pictometry International would have testified to XYZ. You know, they were taken on this day. They were taken using this equipment, and they fairly and accurately depict the Tonawanda Coke Corporation on that day. So in the criminal context, yes, I would absolutely need to have somebody to authenticate. That would be the magic buzzword. Authenticate those images.
This is Idan. Can I chime in?
Yep.
So I think this goes back to the key point that Chris made. Sorry. This goes back to what Chris was saying, where he said everything is about fitness for purpose. The real question is, what are you trying to do with your evidence? So, Scott, Google Earth, I've taken Google Earth photos along with other data into meetings with regulators, and that's really effective. So if you're a citizen and you are trying to go talk sort of techie to techie, you know, to the permit writer or to the engineers at the enforcement department or something else about a particular site, that's great evidence. Not in the legal sense, but in the practical sense. In many civil cases, particularly ones that are easier, and again, these are the ones that are easier for citizens to get involved with, like where the question is not what are they dumping, it's just are they putting anything in the river. Those kinds of simple discharge without a permit cases, I've used it tons of times, never had to take it to court because the defendants fold. Because they really, for the reasons essentially that Aaron and Chris are talking about, they don't want to get into a situation where their defense is, but judge, maybe the satellite was malfunctioning that day and every other day on which there is a photo. In a criminal context, the higher, and so the more sophisticated and the more is at stake, and the more you're trying to prove with it, the more difficult it will be to use satellite imagery, and you'll have to go and get that kind of verification. And frankly, for most people who are not the United States Attorney General, you're not going to have a lot of success calling Pictometry International and asking them to please sign an affidavit for you. But that doesn't mean the stuff isn't available. So even if it's not USGS public data, a lot of this information, for example, a lot of what Google gets that isn't USGS comes from the Worldview satellite. The Worldview satellite is owned by a company, I don't remember its name, it will not sell to you directly. There are tons of resellers in the US on that commercial data. And it could be that the resellers know enough about it or can do an affidavit for you. So I used one called Apollo Imaging, but there are dozens of companies that resell those images. They're not the ones who took the pictures, but they have a preferred contractual relationship with the guys who do take the pictures, and maybe their affidavit's good enough if that comes down to it. But 99% of the time, the level of proof that Aaron is using for a criminal conviction doesn't enter into your case. Most cases don't go that far, and when it really, really matters, yeah, you need to go all the way. But you'd be amazed how much mileage you can get out of Google Earth in regulatory forums, in settlement negotiations, and in backing up other photos. So, for example, the photos I showed that were taken by a guy up in a crane, I have similar photos taken by a hobbyist in a drone in one case. And what we did is we interspersed them with pictures from Google Earth in order to show the court, and in order to show the defense lawyer, more importantly, that the things that we had seen on certain dates had also been happening on other dates, which goes to how big a penalty should these people pay, or in our case, since we don't really take penalties, how large an environmental benefit payment should they make. It was a stormwater polluter, and we used the fact that they've been violating them more times and used the Google Earth proof to essentially get them to pay a larger amount into a local green stormwater infrastructure program. So we both cut down the stormwater pollution coming off their site and then use their funding to essentially remove or help reduce a combined sewer overflow near to their plant. So Google Earth got us quite a long way. It's all about fitness for purpose, as Chris said.
I don't want to belabor this longer, but one other point I would make. Can you guys hear me? Am I?
Yeah, we gotcha.
So one quick point. Another thing, things don't have to be admissible in court to be used in depositions. So if you have a picture that shows that the cows were in one field and not the other in some year, and that becomes a relevant issue, you can show that to someone in deposition, and you can make them feel like you know as much or more than they do about what happened in that year, and get them to admit things based on that photo, even if that photo is not admissible itself. So, you know, that may not apply in the criminal context because you typically have depositions, but where you can go in and show a person a photo in deposition and represent to them this is a 2008 Google aerial and get them to admit things, realizing that that's in fact the truth, and that you may have something on them, I think that's really, really handy. So it's not always about what's admissible in court. It's also what you can use in the process to get the evidence that you need to be admissible in court.
Okay, that's really helpful, Chris. Thank you. Jeff, you're up next. Do you still want to ask your question?
I do. I actually want to ask a different question, if that's all right, just because that last one was so fascinating, and maybe it relates to Stevie's question as well. The question is, I noticed that one of the presenters, I think it was Aaron, mentioned that a photograph is kind of like a proxy for what you have seen with your own eyes, and the crane photo was an interesting case on that because the person's at the top of the crane. But as in the case of a drone or a kite, you may be at the bottom end of something where the camera is not representing your view of it. Or maybe it's a time thing where you left a camera on time-lapse or a closed-circuit security camera and you put it there, but you weren't there at the time the photo was taken. In those cases, does the affidavit work in the same way?
That's a great question.
Well, I'll jump in here.
Sorry, we'll go to Aaron first, then Adon.
Actually,
all right. Well, real quickly, it's a little bit different. Okay, it's a little bit different, If you don't have someone who actually laid eyes on the picture that you're trying to authenticate, then you have to authenticate the process to take that picture. So you have a drone operator say, you know, this is my drone, this is where I bought it from, this is how it operates, it was not malfunctioning on this day, you know, I saw it with my own eyes, I controlled it the whole way. I've tested out the camera previously, and I've never had to do it, so I'd be curious to see what some of the other attorneys have to say. But you'd have to still authenticate the process, the actual mechanism used to take that photograph.
Great.
Nothing to really add to that.
The only thing that I would add is, you know, the law is a lot more common sense than people give it credit for. So, you know, as Aaron was saying, it becomes about the process in that situation. So, you know, if you have a person that will say, I've flown this drone hundreds of times, I flew the drone from this field that went up and it was right above this, you know, discharge area, and this, you know, this is the camera that I used. You know, generally that's going to be admissible. I mean, there's got to be some question about, again, that word reliability of what you're seeing. And if there's no basis to question the reliability, then typically something like that should get in just the same as it would, you know, if somebody was standing right there.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Stevie.
Oh, you're muted, Stevie.
No, she's not.
No? Do I get asked a second question?
No.
I'm just kidding.
No.
Stevie, we can't hear you. Could you try just using your built-in microphone?
Why don't we read it out?
All right, Stevie. I'm going to read your question. Stevie says, "Hi there, thanks for the presentation. I'm curious if any of the lawyers have used photographs of obscured line of sight due to pollution, i.e. sand, dust, or water vapor that's causing opacity in the atmosphere. She continues by saying, I know there is EPA Method 9, which can help people monitor for this, but can photographs also be used?
This is Edan. It's outside of my bailiwick. I really focus on water pollution law. I know a couple people who might be able to answer it, but not online right now. I do know, however, that, again, you have a fairly good low-tech solution here. There is accreditation available to community members who want to be opacity monitors. There's a little minimal amount of training you can do, and if you can do that, you may not need more.
Great, yeah, that's a
I'll
known
jump
method.
in quickly. We did not have to do any real Method 9 issue in our Tonawanda court case, but I don't think pictures would suffice, because I think it all depends on distance from the stack, kind of wind direction, a lot of variables that aren't necessarily recorded in a photograph. Unless the person who's taking the photograph is recording all the appropriate variables that a Method 9 inspector would need to have to make the observation. I really don't, in honesty.
So can I just say one more thing? So I think the question again is what you're trying to prove. So if the question is, can you prove an opacity violation with a picture, then I would defer to Aaron and say that's not in my bailiwick, and you know, I don't know the answer. But can you prove something, say in a civil suit? Let's say you have a suit for nuisance with respect. I've got a suit against a refinery right now, and a suit for nuisance based on the impact on people's quality of life in the neighborhood. And you have pictures that show thick smoke or sand and dust blowing in your direction. Then those photos, I think, would be admissible and certainly relevant to the question about what you're experiencing and what things look like in your neighborhood based on the presence of the smoke and dust and emissions from this facility. So again, it gets to that question of what it is that you're trying to prove. If you're trying to prove a specific violation under a specific code, under a specific regulation that requires a certain test, you may not meet that test. But if you're trying to prove some more common law, you know, a more general civil common law violation that it's impacting your quality of life in your neighborhood, then I think by all means that's probably going to get in and would be helpful type evidence.
Great. Stevie says, thanks so much. Not sure why her audio wasn't working. I guess I can't resist asking one question for me, and also recognizing that we've gone beyond our hour, but we still have viewers, so and we're still grateful for all of your time. So I'd like to, well, I'd also say, Jackie, did you indicate you need to leave?
Yes, I need to leave. So I guess there's no more questions anyways, right?
Not officially, but I'm about to ask one on a different tack. But thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Thank you. See ya.
Okay, see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I wanted to ask the group, and with thinking about Noel's data, you know, temperature data is it's just so direct and straightforward, and the sensors have a really high accuracy rate. I'm just wondering, could the lawyers give any perspective on, say you're going after one environmental issue, but it's hard to actually collect data on that exact issue? Can you give any examples of going after like proxy evidence, even more proxy than a camera is a proxy for someone's own eyes? For instance, going after temperature when really you're worried about a discharge into water that's containing a chemical, but you can more easily prove that there is a discharge by just looking at a simple temperature change versus the regular water body.
So no one's speaking, so I'll fill the vacuum first. So I think again it comes back to first of all, the one thing that we haven't talked about, and I think this brings this issue into the light, is that typically the way that you're getting data like this, at least in a civil context, is through an expert. And so you have hired an expert, or you have an expert that's willing to testify for you, that is basing his or her opinion on the evidence that they have. And so let's say with your example, you've got some evidence of a temperature change. You know that in the past there was a temperature change associated with discharge of a pollutant that's of issue, but for 3 months out of the data, all you have is the temperature data. So you would have the expert testify and opine that there was a discharge of that pollutant for the entire year, even though you only have temperature data for half the year because of certain factors that would indicate to that expert in their experience, based on their degrees, based on everything that they're qualified as an expert for, that during that time where you just have the temperature data, there would also be a pollutant discharge. So I think it again gets back to sort of the reliability, in that case the reliability of the expert's methods for determining or for reaching that conclusion that temperature equates to pollutant. Right? And so I think it's possible. I think it really comes down to the specific facts in the case and what the basis is for that expert equating the two of those and drawing a conclusion that one would indicate the other. Does that make sense? You don't look convinced, but hopefully.
No, it does make sense. Thanks.
I can add something to that too, just more from like a housing perspective. We've had folks come to us and say, could your sensors sense other things besides temperature? So one of the things that was suggested to us was particulate matter, and that would be useful if we could sense sort of dust, that would be useful in helping folks identify illegal construction or construction that was happening outside of sort of I think you can go till like 6 p.m. or something, but if it's happening during the evening, or if there are no permits associated with the construction that's happening, and so technically the city thinks it's not happening, but you can all of a sudden show a massive increase in dust, that might, whether you could fully prosecute someone based just on that data, or whether that data is sort of indicative of a problem that then you can go and explore further. We never actually used, we don't have particulate sensors at this point, but it's definitely something that different city agencies are thinking about.
I've played around with this idea in different. First of all, this happens a lot. There are different ways in which observations are proxies for something that isn't exactly in your data. And sometimes it's implicit. So for example, if you're doing field measurements of water quality, and your device gives you back both a readout on the conductivity of the water and the chloride level in the water, how much salt is in it. Oftentimes, most of the devices, they don't have a separate sensor. They have an equation by which they estimate the amount of chloride in the water based on the conductivity. So, in a sense, you're routinely, it's that process of using proxies is actually built into some of the equipment. Where I've played around with this idea, and I'm talking to a couple people about it, and it's still very nascent. And there's a sort of like an easy way in which this happens, right? When you're talking about, I don't know what's in the water, but the water is brown or the water is orange coming out of that pipe, then essentially you're using orange as a proxy for pollutants. That's a throwaway. Where it gets really interesting is advances in multispectral analysis on satellite imagery or other remotely sensed data. There is, for example, a lab in Minnesota, and it's not the only one in the United States. There are quite a few university labs that are looking at the color spectrum that comes off of water bodies, large enough water bodies, and making inferences or observations about water quality based on them. So, for example, this group in Minnesota has used, I'm trying to remember which satellite it is. It's the big NOAA satellite that gives you 30-meter pixels. I don't remember quite what it's called. So at the moment, it's been a while. Regardless, they're using that data, and they're looking at basically every water body in Minnesota. And what they're looking at is the ratio of red, green, blue light coming off it, and sometimes they've also rented their own planes with super high resolution, or I don't even know what you call it, not multispectral, but very, very narrowly defined spectral bands, 10 nanometer bands. And what they're doing is they're looking at at green versus blue and other items to detect not just how transparent is the water. They can get a very good sense of the turbidity of the water or the clarity of the water. They can also, however, make very good inferences about whether or not the turbidity is being caused by algae blooms, by chlorophyll. The bottom line is that's sort of by proxy, right? You've got an equation that tells you this much blue, this much green, this much red, this much infrared equals chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, whatever it is. That's become a very well-established academic research tool in the same way that you can use it to pick up land cover. And then the question is, can you get that emitted? Can you use it? Is the water body large enough? What can you do with it? So in Minnesota, one possibility is to use that as a check on the states, because states are responsible for examining every water body in the state and assessing what the water quality of it. Does it or does it not meet standards? Is it or is it not suffering from algae blooms? You can actually do a statewide inventory from the air and compare it to the state's official list of polluted water bodies, which is called a 303D list. See where there are problems, and then go talk to the state about them. There are a variety of similar ideas, such as I've actually explored using thermal imagery at power plants initially to discover whether or not the thermal plume from a very large industrial facility or a coal-fired power plant is within the allowed bounds for such a plume. But yeah, it also makes a really good proxy for picking out illicit discharges. We've got colleagues at the Waterkeeper Alliance, who I think Chris has worked with, who've used thermal imagery on riverbanks to show that the water that's coming out is groundwater that is percolating up. And that means if there's pollution in it, it's coming through the ground. That's where that pollution is surfacing and coming into a water body, which is part of showing the connection back to a pollutant source that's further away. So there are all kinds of interesting proxy uses for data. I'm not sure what the bounds of that are, but particularly I think that the use of multispectral analysis is going to be an interesting one to watch in the next couple of years.
Great, thanks. Do any of the presenters have any questions for each other or last thoughts they want to share before we sign off for the day?
This is Scott, if you can hear me. I guess we've had a lot to unpack and learned a lot about the legal process and what constitutes proof in two different legal contexts, the criminal and the civil. But I guess as part of a community organization, we're thinking, and we talked a lot about the importance of who is taking that picture. Will they sign an affidavit? But I think, like, as part of an environmental movement, we're often proving things not just in court, but we have to prove things to the media, prove things to sometimes convince other media something is a problem. So I guess I'm coming away with a lot of new information about the legal process, but also with new thoughts about what constitutes proof, and all the different audiences that we generally try to engage a lot of different kinds of audiences with convincing people about problems. So that's all. The audience matters.
Great, and I mean, you didn't get into the $75,000 fine that your aerial photo won against that, But I also understand you're often going not to the court with your photographs, but directly working with regulatory agencies. And those are different kind of cases to make, different audiences.
Right. It's a different kind of case. It's a different kind of argument. It can be a more technical argument, but especially in Louisiana, where we don't have government folks, don't have a lot of resources, they're thinking about court because the company's going to sue them for taking action. So they're also, at the one hand, they have like two minds. One is a technical mind, and one is also this legal mind. So as a community, if you can give the government person who's under-resourced an argument that they know that they can take to court, they're more willing to take steps on their own because they feel like they're undergirded. If you can present your argument to them to where it sounds like you could go to court with it, they're more willing to take actions that perhaps they could have taken anyway. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but I think there's this kind of chilling effect that a lot of government people are operating under.
I think Scott's making a very, very important point. In my experience, that's exactly right. A lot of most of my clients are environmental groups, and a lot of what my clients are doing is actually just empowering government officials to go do what they wanted to do or what the evidence told them to do, but what politically they've been told not to do. And giving them rock-solid evidence can be extremely helpful, particularly where you have let's leave party politics out of it. The bottom line is, if you're out there and you're gathering geocoded photographs or other evidence, just keep compiling it, just keep putting it together, because there are a variety of forms in which it's useful, and you'd be amazed how far you can get with it outside of court. And that includes in convincing government officials to do what you thought was their job anyway. But there are people, very powerful people within the government who've told them not to do it. And that happens a lot more than I'd like to see.
Great. Thanks, Scott and Adon, for that point right at the end of our talk. I want to thank all the presenters for their time in preparing and meeting each other ahead of time and sharing and going over today to 90 minutes to share their knowledge with the broader public lab community and other interested people who have found or may find this in the future. This topic, though, concepts of proof, and the types of campaigns and cases that are built around citizen-led research, that is a live topic in public lab, and it will continue to develop. I know there are more stories from even more local research that we could have pulled into this hour, and we will be kind of bringing those stories more to the forefront as we help people organize their research into an actual campaign strategy. And so we do hope that we can be in touch with all of the generous presenters who have joined us this time. And we hope to give everyone more time in full to discuss their project in particular, and not only through the lens of the design of their data. And with that, I will just sign off for the June Open Hour, and I hope to see everybody next month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See you later.
See ya.